The second century begins from a Christian perspective with Ignatius of Antioch. He's another one of the Apostolic Fathers, along with Clement and the Didache. The Apostolic Fathers are those early Christian writers who knew the apostles personally. Saint Ignatius of Antioch was the second bishop of Antioch to succeed to St. Peter. So he knew St. Peter himself and presumably knew St. John and probably several other apostles as well. He was martyred in Rome, devoured by the wild beasts in the arena for his faith. And on his way to Rome to meet his death, he wrote to a number of different Christian communities. And these letters are immensely valuable witness to the life of the church at her very beginning. He is very strong in emphasizing the threefold ministry of bishop, priest and deacon. Indeed, he states that without bishops, priests and deacons, one cannot call a community a church, and that reflects the continued practice of the Catholic Church to this day. In official documents, the Church always refers to those groups derived from the Reformation who have not retained a valid Eucharist or apostolic succession as ecclesial communities, church-like groups, essentially, whereas the Church recognizes that the Church of the East, the Oriental Orthodox and the Greek and Russian Orthodox are true particular churches, even if they are separated from the unity of the Catholic Church. They have all 7 sacraments validly. Saint Ignatius also emphasizes the communication of idioms. This is a very important doctrinal point, that we can say things of our Lord as God, which are true of him only in virtue of his human nature. So, for example, we can say that God bled on the cross. This usage occurs a couple of times in the New Testament. St. Paul says that if the principalities and powers had realized who he was, they would never have crucified the Lord of glory. That's an instance of the communication of idioms. In the Acts of the Apostles, St. Paul talks about us being redeemed through God's blood. Again, that's another instance of the communication of idioms. Saint Elizabeth in St. Luke's Gospel talks about being visited by the mother of my Lord, which is an allusion to the doctrine that Our Lady is the Mother of God. And in fact, Saint Ignatius calls Mary the Mother of God, which is the most famous instance of the communication of idioms. Saint Ignatius strongly emphasizes the role of the Eucharist. He attacks a group of early heretics called the Docetists, who denied the reality of our Lord's bodily humanity. And in doing so, he says that they even refuse to attend the Eucharist because they deny that it is the self-same body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ, bearing strong witness there to the doctrine of the real presence. In fact, the Didache, which we mentioned when we were talking about the first century, also alludes to the sacrificial nature of the Eucharist, saying not to receive the Eucharist without having first confessed one's sins, so that one's sacrifice may be a pure one. So we see the Church's later Eucharistic doctrine alive and well in the assumptions and words of the very earliest witnesses to the Christian tradition. There's also a possible allusion to the tradition of celibacy in the writings of Saint Ignatius. In one of his letters to Polycarp, he talks about those who remain chaste for the sake of the Lord's flesh. So this seems to be a connection. It's not necessarily clergy that he's talking about in that passage, but he's drawing a connection between abstention from conjugal relations and the Eucharist, which obviously would imply that those who are most closely related to the Eucharist, priests and bishops, and might be expected to be perfectly continent. In fact, St. Paul talks about continence as one of the necessary virtues of a presbyter in the epistle to Titus. So we have an early witness there to clerical celibacy. It's slightly misleading, though, to talk about clerical celibacy, because it's clear that in the early church, as St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians, continence, perfect continence, virginity or celibacy is considered to be the ideal form of life for a Christian in general. So probably in the earliest centuries, people didn't think about perfect continence as particularly associated with the clergy, because it was quite a widespread practice. In fact, we have an account of one bishop in Knossos in Crete, which is preserved by the 4th century church historian Eusebius of Caesarea, who seems to have mistakenly thought that, in fact, one couldn't really get married after baptism. Now, obviously, this is definitely not true, but to even fall into this error, which he was otherwise an Orthodox bishop, implies that it was taken for granted that the default form of life of Christians was one in which they lived a life of perfect continence, while marriage still being perfectly legitimate, and indeed the forbidding of marriage being seen as a sign of unorthodox beliefs, because there were other heretics with the same errors as the Docetists around in the 2nd century, most particularly the Gnostic heresy, which was a kind of garbled, dumbed-down Platonism fused in an incorrect way with fragments of Christianity, I suppose is the best way of describing it. But the Gnostics were extremely hostile to the material world. They considered it to be the product of an evil lesser god, who they identified as the God of the Old Testament. And so they were opposed to anything which involved the flesh, and therefore opposition to marriage as such is a sign that one might be associated with this heretical sect. We have many other Christian authors of the 2nd century. There's another martyr, Saint Polycarp, the Bishop of Smyrna, to whom, as I mentioned, Saint Ignatius wrote on his way to be martyred. He was martyred around the middle of the 2nd century, Saint Polycarp, and he also knew Saint John personally. We have a letter that he wrote, and we have an account of his martyrdom, which are also immensely valuable. Saint Polycarp, just before he dies, in the account of his martyrdom, employs a Trinitarian formula which clearly equates in majesty and dignity the 3 divine persons. See, that's very important. Ignatius, of course, is also very clear about the divinity of our Lord. It's not that the New Testament isn't also clear on these points. It's simply that in later centuries, heretics have largely not attempted to fiddle with the canon of the New Testament. They have, some of them, the Gnostics, certainly made up their own fake gospels to support their doctrines, but most later heretics have instead tried to misinterpret the writings of the New Testament, and because they accept, and they know that the people they're trying to convince accept the inerrancy of the New Testament, they will never concede that some verse of the New Testament simply refutes their position. They'll always come up with some tortured explanation. That's why the Apostolic Fathers are so important, because they bear witness to how these words were originally read by the people who received the original apostolic tradition. In fact, many non-Catholics convert to the faith simply by reading Early Christian Writings, which is a volume published by Penguin Classics, which contains translations of all the writings of the Apostolic Fathers. And many people, on reading that book, immediately see that the Catholic interpretation of the New Testament is really the only defensible one. So it's well worth having spare copies of that book to give to your friends. Saint Polycarp was in turn a friend of Saint Irenaeus of Lyon. Irenaeus of Lyon was also from Asia Minor, the same region of the Roman Empire as Polycarp, but he ended up as Bishop of Lyon in France. Lyon was probably the most important city in Gaul, as it then was, in the 2nd century. And so he's a very powerful witness, St. Irenaeus. He's not himself directly an apostolic father. He's one further remove. He knew people who knew the apostles. But he's very close to the source. and he is the bishop of a western see, so in the Latin-speaking part of the Roman Empire, but he is from the ancient eastern part of the empire, where St. Paul himself and many of the other apostles were directly active, and therefore he is a witness to both parts of the Roman Empire, and he has two main surviving writings. One of them is a work called Against the Heresies, which is a refutation of Gnosticism, and it goes through all the different versions of Gnosticism. The many wild and wonderful different structures that the Gnostics produced. Of course, they're called Gnostics because from the Greek word gnosis, meaning knowledge, because they claim to possess secret, hidden knowledge about what the New Testament was really about and what really happened, a sort of Dan Brown version of Christianity, and they lured people in with this alleged secret knowledge. So Irenaeus' main strategy in refuting them is simply to describe their supposed secrets in technicolor detail and make them sound as absurd as they are. But in doing that, he bears witness to the true apostolic teaching. He's very strong on the authority of the Pope, because he's talking about the public succession of teaching among the bishops. He's denying the existence of a secret, hidden collection of apostolic doctrine. He says that the teaching of the church has always been proclaimed from the housetops. It's always been public. St. Paul in 2 Timothy 2:2, he talks to Timothy, who's the first bishop of Ephesus, appointed by St. Paul himself, and he tells him to pass on to other worthy men the teachings which he received from the apostles in the presence of many witnesses. So there we have a direct description of how apostolic succession works through the succession of the bishops to the apostles, through the transmission of public teaching, through preaching and open catechesis, not through any secret hidden knowledge. So in order to vindicate the true apostolic doctrine, Saint Irenaeus is alluding to the succession of the apostles, the succession of the bishops from the apostles, and he says he could supply us with lists of the succession lines for all the ancient sees, but there's no need to do all that, because all he needs to do is provide the line of succession for the very ancient, very authoritative, very great Church of Rome, founded by the apostles Peter and Paul. And he gives us the list of all the popes from St. Peter down to his own day, when St. Eleutherius was the pope. And that, of course, is very important, and he specifies that all churches are obliged to agree with this church on account of its preeminent authority. So there we have an allusion to papal infallibility. We see a slightly more oblique but still important allusion to the same authoritative status of the Roman Church in Ignatius's letters earlier in the 1st century. He writes to various different churches on his way to Rome, but he also writes to the Roman Church. He's much more deferential when he writes to the Roman Church. He's kind of giving orders and talking down in a friendly, charitable way, but he's talking down to the other churches he's writing to. But when he writes to Rome, it's very much, he even says, "Who am I to instruct you? I am not Peter, I am not Paul." So he's acknowledging that the Roman Church is more authoritative than the other churches, including himself. He himself is a successor of St. Peter at Antioch, so he would be the second or third highest ranking bishop in the church by later estimation. But he is deferring to the Church of Rome, and he's alluding to the fact that it was founded by St. Peter and St. Paul. Again, something which Clement alludes to, and in the 90s of the 1st century, and Clement also bears witness to the authority of the Roman Church by the very fact that he's sending orders binding in sin to a church in faraway Corinth. We also have in the 1st century a group of writers called the Apologists. These were probably not in direct contact with the apostles, but they're not as reliable authors as the ones I've already alluded to, who were bishops and who were in immediate contact with the apostles or their direct successors. But they are still very important and interesting. And foremost among, they're basically writing defenses of the faith against pagan attack in that period. Many of their writings are addressed to the emperors. The most important of them is St. Justin Martyr. He grew up in Samaria. He probably wasn't a Samaritan, but he grew up in the region of Samaria, so he was living in the very place where the events of the New Testament occurred. And he conducted a long search for the truth of things, for the true way to follow in life. And he tried out many different philosophical schools. He tried out the Pythagoreans. He decided not to follow them because they said he had to spend years studying geometry before they'd let him go on to study philosophy. He tried the Stoics, but he was put off them by the fact that they were materialists. He tried the Aristotelians. He amusingly turned them down because they insisted that he pay up front for his classes before they would teach him anything. And finally, he fixed on the Platonists, who he decided were the nearest to the truth. And this was the general opinion of the early church fathers. They tended to gravitate to all kind of Aristotelianizing Platonism over the course of the first centuries of the church. And so he spent a number of years studying Platonic philosophy. But then one day he was walking along the side of the sea, and he came across an old man who was a Christian, and they started talking about the great mysteries of life, and he discovered that all the sublime truths which he had found among the Platonists were already known to this simple old man simply because he'd received the gospel and submitted to the teaching of the apostles and their successors. And so he abandoned pagan philosophy altogether and became a Christian. And he interestingly remarks, "This is how and why I became a philosopher." So he actually sees that he's only truly a philosopher once he becomes a Christian, because only truly a lover of wisdom once he is in contact with the uncreated wisdom, the eternal Logos, our Lord Jesus Christ, through faith and baptism. Justin gives us a very interesting description of what the Eucharist was like in the early church. It's very much, it could be a description of a Mass at any Catholic cathedral today. It's quoted in full by the Catechism of the Catholic Church, so you can go and look it up there. But again, he talks about how the Eucharist, after its consecration, is no longer treated as mere bread, because it's been transformed by the consecratory power of the bishop. It's important to remember that the 2nd century was the apogee of the Roman Empire. It was ruled, at least until 180, it was ruled by sane, competent emperors. There were a sequence of 5 emperors who each adopted somebody as their successor because they thought that he was up to the job, not because he was related to them. Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius famously left the empire to his rather ridiculous son Commodus, and then things began to degenerate after that. But in the meantime, from a pagan perspective, things were going very nicely, thank you. The Roman Empire reached its apogee in 117 AD at the death of the Emperor Trajan, who's succeeded by Hadrian, who added Dacia, what's now modern Romania, and large parts of Armenia and what's now Iraq to the Roman Empire. He was troubled towards the end of his reign by what's called the Second Jewish Revolt. The first Jewish revolt is the one that was brutally put down by Vespasian and Titus in 70 AD when the temple was destroyed, an event which was seen as a dramatic vindication of Christianity. The Second Jewish Revolt didn't occur in the Holy Land. It was a coordinated series of riots by the Jewish population of the empire in cooperation with the Parthians, the rulers of modern Iran, because it looked as if Trajan might well conquer the whole of what is now Iran. He certainly was hoping to, although he thought perhaps he was too old to make it, and he was right, but he was hoping to equal the conquests of Alexander the Great and reach the Indus River, the frontier with India. He wasn't able to do that, even though he did add important extra sections to the Roman Empire, because he was too old and he died. But the Jews appear to have agreed with the Parthians that if they revolt against the Romans and distract them if the Parthians make a successful counterattack and conquer the Mediterranean, east coast of the Mediterranean, which later on the Persians did do many centuries later, then they would get the Holy Land back as a reward. This didn't work out. The Second Jewish Revolt was put down, but it reflected the continuing tensions and to some extent escalating tensions between the Jews and the Romans. The Third Jewish Revolt occurred in the 130s in the reign of the Emperor Hadrian. This was triggered by the attempt to replace Jerusalem with a new pagan city named after the Emperor Hadrian, whose name was Publius Aelius Hadrianus. He wanted to rename Jerusalem Aelia Capitolina and bury the Christian and Jewish sites underneath new pagan sites. A false messiah called Bar Kokhba led the Jews into a new rebellion against the Roman Empire, which was brutally suppressed as the others had been. And Jews, whether Christian or non-Christian, were forbidden from living in the Holy Land. Many cities were destroyed. Jerusalem was replaced by Aelia Capitolina. And the Holy Sepulchre was buried as a Jewish site, as it was seen, was buried under a temple to the goddess Venus, and a statue of Jupiter was built over Mount Calvary. So not until the conversion of Constantine in the 4th century, would these sites be accessible again. And Jews were forbidden from living in the Holy Land. The name of the province of Judea was changed to Syria Palestina in order to try and break the association with the Jewish people. And this brought to an end the succession of the Jewish Christian bishops of Jerusalem, which began with the Apostle James. And from that point onwards, the bishops of Jerusalem have Gentile names, and Jerusalem ceases to be, until the conversion of Constantine, an important see in the Christian church, because most of its population have gone because they were Jewish Christians, and it ends up under the authority of the Metropolitan See of Caesarea in Palestine, instead of being the preeminent bishop of the Holy Land. So this is a great loss, of course, for the church. The traditions of the Church of Jerusalem are nevertheless preserved in one of the 7 Catholic rites, the Syriac rite. The Church has, you'll see this described in paragraph 1203 of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, the Church has 7 liturgical traditions derived from the Apostles. The Roman rite, which most Catholics belong to, the Byzantine rite, which is probably at that time centered on Ephesus, the Coptic rite, based on the See of Alexandria, founded by St. Mark, the Syriac rite, whose traditions come from Jerusalem, the Maronite rite, whose traditions come from Antioch, and the Chaldean rite in what is now Iraq, which stretched on to India. That church was established by St. Thomas, and the Armenian tradition, which is established by tradition according to St. Jude, the Apostle St. Jude. And so the Catholic Church only has 7 patriarchs of jurisdiction, and each of them belongs to one of these ancient apostolic rites. You may see, whenever there's a pope dies and a new pope is appointed, prior to his inauguration in St. Peter's Square, he prays before the tomb of St. Peter in St. Peter's Basilica, and you'll see standing behind him 6 other bishops, and those are the other 6 patriarchs, in addition to the Patriarch of Rome, each of whom belongs to one of those ancient apostolic rites. You see the existence of what would later become the Byzantine rite in the 2nd century, illustrated by a conflict between what are called the Quatrodecimans and the Bishop of Rome. People in Asia Minor were still celebrating Easter on Passover, so after the first full moon after the vernal equinox, instead of the date of Easter as it was observed elsewhere in the church, which was observed on the first Sunday after the first full moon after the vernal equinox, which to this day is the correct way of calculating Easter. The Bishop of Rome was angered by this divergence of practice and threatened disciplinary measures against the Christians in Asia Minor, again showing the sweep of the Bishop of Rome's authority in the early church. But Saint Irenaeus persuaded Pope Eleutherius not to excommunicate the Christians of Asia Minor, because he said that this has been the practice of the Apostle John, and they shouldn't be bullied for continuing to follow it. And it seems as if the Bishop of Rome relented. It's interesting because it illustrates a doctrine that was defined by the Council of Florence, that the phasing out of the rites of the old law in 3 periods. The Council of Florence teaches that at the moment of our Lord's death, the rites of the old law lost their efficacy and binding power. So you could no longer cleanse a child of original sin through circumcision by the faith of the parents, as was possible until the moment of our Lord's death. And the sacrifices of the temple and the other rites of the old law were no longer availing in the sight of God, but they were not forbidden for Jewish Christians. They were dead but not deadly, as the saying goes. But when the gospel had been promulgated, when public revelation was complete with the death of St. John, probably around 100 AD, the rites of the old law became dead and deadly, so they were forbidden as well as no longer being efficacious. But of course, the last place where that would have come into effect would have precisely been Asia Minor, because St. John, after the Assumption of our Blessed Lady, moved to Ephesus and lived for many decades there. And so probably that was the last place where the rites of the old law were occurring concurrently in the Christian community with the sacraments of the new law. And that's probably why the Christians of that region were used to celebrating the Easter on the feast of Passover. And it gives us an insight into the existence of these parallel rites even as early as the 2nd century. Saint Eleutherius' successor as Bishop of Rome, Pope Victor, he was one of the African popes, came from Rome and North Africa, the Latin-speaking parts of North Africa west of Libya. He seems to have been one of the first popes to introduce Latin of any description into the Roman liturgy, which up to that point had been in Greek. And the reason for this is that Rome was the great centre of power and wealth in the Roman Empire, being the capital, obviously. And so there was a great migration of educated Greek-speaking peoples from the Eastern Mediterranean to Rome, where they could make a career for themselves. And this began to decline after 117, when Trajan died, because the Roman Empire stopped increasing in size from that point. And so the greater antiquity and greater wealth of the eastern provinces began to tell, and it began to suck population back towards the east, including sucking Latin-speaking Celts from the further western provinces into Rome. And so the general population of Rome became Latin-speaking again, instead of being Greek-speaking, as it had been in the 1st century. That's why, of course, Mark's Gospel is in Greek. And so the Roman Rite begins to move into Latin, a significant change in the history of the Church, further implications of which we will see unfold when we look at the 3rd century.